I find it quite interesting that despite David Cage being a not very well liked figure in the gaming community, so many people come in defense of him when people try to censor his games. And they should defend him. Video game developers should be allowed to make whatever games they want, regardless of whether or not they're gonna turn it to garbage, because how else would you know if it's garbage unless they released it and people played it? David Cage absolutely should have the ability to make video games so that 1, some people can enjoy them, and so that 2, most people can pinpoint into his games and say, no, this is not how you balance your tone. David Cage is, in my opinion, an interesting figure who makes overly melodramatic games that only produce laughter out of me. He just simply cannot make a game with a balanced tone. Although most of his games are doom and gloom, his happy, sappy moments are so happy it feels like you're entering Sophia the First after watching The Zodiac. He cannot make a game with a consistent tone, nor can he make a game that transitions from one to another very well. So of course I'm interested in Detroit Become Human, and I'm interested in how the game pulls off the branching paths, because despite my feelings in how David Cage handles the story, at least permadeaths and endings caused by little bits and pieces of bad actions that you do in the game is a more accurate representation of branching choices and butterfly effect than select ending here. Anyway, we're gonna talk about that child abuse scene from the trailer again. I want you to guess the sorts of people who would care about the child abuse scene instead of the actual gameplay or the branching paths that these David Cage games give. If your guess is that these people cannot distinguish between Nintendo Entertainment System and Nintendo Switch, then you would be right. These people are not gamers. At all. Again, fiction is one of the most evil entities in the entire planet. They will not give a fuck about your children, they will abuse them, they will rape them, they will molest them. Why would you complain about Detroit having a scene of child abuse when the movie It has done much worse to children? Or what about the Walking Dead series? Or The Last of Us?
Abusers will get off on this stuff. Sony under fire for a repulsive video game Detroit Become Human, which shows girl 10 beaten to death by her father. Amongst a host of child abuse and domestic violence acts players watch.
You know that you can change the outcomes of those scenarios by playing the game, right? It's literally advertised in the trailer. It's pretty weird that you're complaining about story elements that players can change in the game. It's like going after Mass Effect and complaining that the Reapers are taking over the galaxy. Yes, you dummy, that's why you, as Commander Shepard, can save the universe from being taken over by the Reapers. At least before the bad endings hit. Now, the article proceeds to describe the scenes that happen in the trailer, which, in my opinion, would be so much better if you see the trailer yourself. I'll link to it in the description down below. Even if you're not a fan of David Cage games, I think it's important for you to understand the nuance of what we're talking about here. So check out the trailer down below, it's only 3 minutes long. And the most ironic part about all of this is that the more and more you publish articles decrying this, the more and more people are going to look for the trailers or the promotional materials or David Cage's other works. That is, unless you give a convincing argument in why people should avoid this game at all costs, which, judging from the headline, you are not. So try again.
Childline founder Dame Esther Ranson called the game made for PlayStation 4 console sick and repulsive. She urged publisher Sony Interactive Entertainment to either remove the child abuse scene or withdraw the game. Violence against children is not entertainment. It's not a game. It's a real nightmare for thousands of children who have to live through these kinds of scenarios. The makers of this game should be thoroughly ashamed. I think it's perverse. Who thinks beating a child is entertainment?
Ma'am, I think you're taking these scenes completely out of its fictional context. It's not exactly Skyrim's killable children. Depictions are not endorsement. By your own logic, Marvel shouldn't make Infinity War because there's war in it. Who thinks that war is entertainment? It's a real nightmare for thousands of soldiers who suffer from PTSD. I guarantee that child abuse victims have way bigger balls than any of you combined. They are way more concerned with moving on with their life rather than how a video game depicts them. Oh sure, some of you might say, but if it was done by David Cage, anything that he makes in current year will turn into garbage. Valid point, but just because it's garbage doesn't make it immoral, and that also doesn't mean that he doesn't have the right to make them. That's why people are reluctantly defending David Cage. They know his games are garbage, but they also realize that he is a game developer and has the right to make how many garbage games he wants.
Andy Burroughs on the NSPCC added, any video games that trivialize or normalizes child abuse, neglect, or domestic violence for entertainment is unacceptable.
Again, you're taking the scenes out of context. Depictions of child abuse does not equal endorsement, and the game does not treat it as if it's an entertaining thing. And since this is a David Cage game, which means the game is going to be made for adults anyway, I don't think you should be worried. But then again, we're talking about classic moral guardians being worried about violence in video games. These guys are gonna be worried when you eat candies and will micromanage every aspect of your life.
But the man who wrote and directed the game tried to deflect the criticism of the abuse scene by describing it as very strong and moving.
Yeah, you can create drama out of child abuse in fiction, and again, you can say that David Cage always fails spectacularly at it, but again, he has the right to make that, and you cannot argue with that. The article that decides to recite what happened with GTA San Andreas with the hot coffee mod, this is just absolute moral panic.
The NSPCC's Mr. Burrows said research has shown that children and young people often play 18+ games before they reach this age.
Yeah. And I am one of those people. I am just 1 year old above 18 just now. But I have good parents that can teach me what's right and wrong. Do you?
And Peter Saunders, founder of the National Association of People Abused in Childhood, said abusers will get off of this stuff. And the other thing we know beyond discretion is that video games end up being played by children. And scarily, the proliferation of salacious and abusive images is actually encouraging violence and abuse.
Abusive images actually encourage violence and abuse. I went out of that trailer, I jerked off to it, and I abused children for my own pleasure. Does that sound remotely logical to you?
And we know that abuse in all forms is escalating on this planet, so why not help to tackle it constructively rather than sensationalize and making money out of it?
Yeah, you can't make that sort of comment unless you play the actual game. You don't know whether or not David Cage tackles it constructively or sensationalize it. But then again, your standards of sensationalizing child abuse is you make money off of it. So by your logic, you are also sensationalizing child abuse by profiting off of talking about it. Also, I love how the Daily Mail uses the picture of a really good, respectable Tory MP gentleman on the left, but uses the most disgusting picture of David Cage on the right. I mean, look at that freaking child abuser. How dare he makes fictional content. But to be fair to the Daily Mail, they also put a pretty scary image of one of the critics.
It is completely wrong for domestic violence to be a part of video game regardless of what the motivation is. Domestic violence is not a game, and this simply trivializes it. I worry that people who play this who themselves have suffered abuse will use this game to shape the way in which they deal with abusers. It's dangerous to plant the seed in people's minds that the way to deal with abusers is to use violence against them. It's counterproductive and could put them in even more danger.
How do you know that the solution to combat the abuser is to beat them? Have you actually played the game? Is that really the solution? I mean, I guess that's one out of the many game's choices. You can also just run away. But then again, the choices have consequences too. Also, this is a work of fiction. From Oxford English Dictionary, fiction, literature in the form of prose, especially short stories and novels, that describes imagery, events, and people. From dictionary.com, fiction, the class of literature comprising works of imaginative narration, especially in prose form. From Merriam-Webster, fiction, something invented by the imagination or feigned, specifically an invented story.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
Children's Commissioner for England Anne Longfield said that whatever the maker's motivation, it seems to end up in a clumsy, inappropriate, and graphic gameplay that is no more than an unpleasant, exploitative way of making money off of the back of real suffering.
So your argument is, don't make fiction tackling issues of child abuse, it's going to be garbage anyway, and people make money off of it. Again, refer to the definition of fiction. People make money off of fiction, just in case you missed it. Notice how pretty much 100% of these people, yes, 100%, are not actual gamers. They're all just sleazy politicians who act as moral guardians for people who suffer from child abuse. Little did they know that child abuse victims don't want to be treated like, well, victims. The same way people who suffer from disabilities don't want to be treated like victims. A lot of times people just want to be treated equally and not be looked down upon. But you did. So who's being more offensive here? So that's the attack on David Cage's freedom of expression by the Daily Mail. The Guardian of all people puts an article with a legitimately good argument. Still, that doesn't make the headline any less sensational.
How not to turn child abuse into a game. A trailer for David Cage's Detroit Become Human hints at the danger of trivializing sensitive social issues.
Thankfully, The Guardian doesn't really argue much. Instead, the writer just recites the interview that David Cage had during the game event, which I addressed in my last video. They also made some small comments. For example,
any independent interviewer would question an author or film director on their handling on sensitive material, especially if, as in Cage's case, there's been a yawning gap between the previous work's ambition and achievement. The implication that Cage, as a video game creator, is being held to a higher standard than his cinematic or literary counterpart would seem somewhat disingenuous.
Of course it's disingenuous, which is why people don't use that argument. Of course David Cage shouldn't be held to a higher standard just because he develops video games instead of movies or books. My argument on that entire interview is, why do you keep making this a moral issue? As an interviewer, especially an interviewer for a Eurogamer no less, why don't you talk about the gameplay, the branching paths, the consequences of your actions, etc. Instead, you talk about how child abuse is a sensitive material in fiction. In other news, water is wet. Jeez.
Video games typically offer player agency, the opportunity to make choices that redirect the story or at least nudge the plot into alternative parabolas. The trailer makes it clear that Detroit Become Human is a game steered by player choices, a kind of hyper-evolved version of the choose-your-own-adventure game books from the 1980s, when readers would, at the end of each plot beat, make a dramatic choice and turn to the indicated page to see how the choice played out. When these game mechanics are married with the theme of domestic abuse and in particular child abuse, the obvious implication is that to escape the violence, a victim or those around them need to only make the correct choices to resolve the situation. It's a deeply troubling misrepresentation of the reality for anyone who has suffered from or who knows a survivor of domestic abuse.
Now this is what I'm talking about. This is a good argument. It invites interesting questions. Can Detroit trivialize the issues of child abuse because the game arbitrarily makes the most correct choices for the player so that those child abuse scenes don't happen? Since this is a choose-your-own-adventure game, would it operate in the same adventure game mood logic? If it does, then does that imply that child abuse can simply be resolved through those mood logic solutions? If the game's morality is gray and gray, would the game's route reflect those values in that not one route is correct and that every route has equal consequences, including when you prevent said child abuse? What would happen if you do? What would happen if you don't? What are the consequences for each, etc.? These are honestly very good questions. I want to know the answer for these questions, but the game hasn't been released yet, so I cannot wait to see it for myself. Still, just because it's a good argument doesn't mean it's flawed, because even if the game uses moon logic to resolve the child abuse issue, it's still a work of fiction. It's a work of fiction that handles the issues of child abuse poorly, but it's still a work of fiction, and David Cage has the right to make that. Again, David Cage might not be a good writer, but at least his games actually have branching paths, permadeaths, and multiple endings that actually matter based on the choices you've made throughout the game, instead of just a simple multiple choices in the end. Ironic that this ends up making me want to buy the game more. I don't know if that's your intention, Guardian, but it's definitely not your intention, Daily Mail. If you want to convince people to not buy your game, here, let me show you. Oh wow, this game Detroit Become Human looks interesting. I want to see how the game does branching paths and consequences. I cannot wait for this game to be released so that I can go out and buy this game.